He's one who's fed the last 7 out of the last 10 years, but he flies to the eastern area of Brisbane. It's probably different flying up there with a much more humid climate, and also they race 3 or 4 different lines, so you have to have quite a bit of skill in training birds for what is their preferred option at the time. He's also been a leading pigeon administrator for as long as I can remember. Put your hands together for Len Vanderlyn.
Queenslander.
Okay, like I've got written up there, I'm having a year off this year. I've been racing pigeons continuously for 38 years. I've had pigeons a lot longer than that. I've had them since I was a kid. But I started racing seriously as an adult in 1983. I've been very, very successful at that. Some of the stuff I've just general stuff I've put up there. I'll just move on to the next one if I can. Now, like I said, I've been racing for 38 years, very successful in club and section racing. Not only successful at it, but very consistent at it. You can see up there, I've won 26 Open Federation or Combine races during that time. I won the averages, the Federation averages in 2014. I had an operation in 2015 and I run 4th in the, because I missed some races with that. I run 4th that year, and then I won the averages 16, 17 and 18, 3 years in a row from 3 different directions. That had never been done before up there. And then I had 2 lean years in 2019 and 2020, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. But then I come back and I won the averages again last year. Now last year we had 26 races and I finished in the top 20 in every single race from start to finish. No one else in the Federation did that. We also finished top 10 15 times in that as well. And I'm telling you all that just to point out that that's consistency, and I'm consistent in doing that with what I've got as a system. I've got a routine, a system. I've got a family of pigeons that are bred around the pigeons that fly well for me. I maintain that family, and I've got a good loft. So I'd like to talk to you about those 3 things about what I do. Oh, that's just 2018, what I won 5 or 6 federations that year. That's last year, sorry. Okay, first of all I'll talk about my system. I haven't got as many words in me as Colin, so it probably won't take as long. I started breeding, or made my pigeons up 55 to 60 days before the last race of the year. I obviously spent a month or 2 prior to that planning the matings. I spent a lot of time doing that. I keep very good records of my pigeons, very good records of their performances. I keep good pedigrees of them. Some people will tell you that a pedigree is just a piece of paper and you don't send pedigrees to races, and all that's true. But a pedigree that lists all the performances of your birds is a very valuable item. Very valuable. If it's just got a list of ring numbers, then yeah, it's just a piece of paper and it's worthless. But I go over those pedigrees and the performances of the birds, and I spend a lot of time blending them together, planning on how I'm going to mate them. Then I mate them up 55 to 60 days before that last race. Now the reason I do that is that the first round of youngsters will be ready to come over into the loft when we basket for that last race. So the pigeon racing never really stops. That's why I'm having a year off this year, to take the wife on a bit of travelling, because you can't have racing pigeons and do any travelling. So those young pigeons come over on that last race and they come into the loft, and I have to separate them when they come in. It's a very important part of my system. Hens and cocks have to be separated. Now what I do, I put the hens over to the right and the cocks over to the left, and I only start letting those young pigeons out in the afternoons. And I'll let them out in the afternoons for a couple of weeks. So when I say let them out, I let the hens out one afternoon, the cocks out the next afternoon. Now the idea is that when they're entering that loft, they're learning to break left or right. That becomes an important part of my system later in the year. So those young pigeons are learning to go to the left or the right every time they go out. They're going out separate in the afternoons only. I also spend a lot of time teaching those pigeons to eat properly. Pigeons that you've been fed in your stock loft, fed on your breeding mix, they're fed on that when I first bring them over. Those young pigeons, or pigeons in general, are not very intelligent. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but pigeons everything a pigeon knows is instinctive or what it's been taught. So I make sure I teach them the lessons that I want them to know. So I teach them how to eat properly. They've been eating that stockbird food up until now. I make sure they're eating in the race loft, and then I'll start to give them the big grains. Nothing but the big grains, like the corn and the peas. As you probably know, we feed a lot of corn up there in Queensland, so I want to make sure they're all eating the same amount of food or the same size grains. Now that's very important later on when you're trying to prepare your pigeons, because if some of them are only eating the small grains and the other ones are eating the big grains, you can never get them all the same, and you won't be able to bring them, or I won't be able to bring them up to the way I want to bring them up. I mentioned in there, go back to that one please. I mentioned in there that during the breeding, I don't give my stockbirds any medication prior to breeding. I will treat them for lice or worms, but I won't treat them for anything else. I don't treat them for canker or coxswain or anything else. I do believe in dry droppings. I do believe pigeons have to be exposed to the dry droppings within your loft. In my opinion, pigeons are, well, they're a flock bird, they're like a dirty bird, like budgerigars are the same. A lot of the immune systems that your pigeons will develop in your own loft is within those dry droppings. And I like to expose my stock birds to those dry droppings, and I like to expose the young birds to them later on. So I don't give them any medication other than, like I said, that worming and that treatment. I use the high protein mix, obviously. I only breed 2 rounds of pigeons because I want to be finished by November. That's also part of my system. I want all those young birds in that loft. I want them all to be taught how to eat. I want to teach them what hunger is. I don't mean starving them, but young pigeons fed all they can eat. They don't really know what hunger is. They don't really understand what it's about, so I teach them about that as well. And I mentioned I separate them, and I've got a special loft layout which I'll discuss later, and I'll teach them to me. Now, like I said, the youngsters are out separate in the afternoons only for the first couple of weeks. In the afternoons only, pigeons obviously have a desire to get back into the loft as darkness approaches, so they're easier to control, and I call them in with a rattle feed. I always rattle the feeds in, call them in, make a lot of noise about it, feed them around my hands so they understand my hands and the feed's coming out of that. Any pigeons that are a bit slower coming back in, that'll be part of the hunger treatment. I won't give them anything to eat, or they'll only get a small amount if they come in a bit late. I'm very religious about that. If pigeons fool around too much, then I won't feed them then, and I won't feed them the next morning, and by the next one then they really start trapping. That's the teaching them hunger, teaching them that if you're hungry, or you're thirsty, or you're scared, get back in that loft. I want to really emphasise that to the pigeons. Like I said, you've got to teach them all these habits. If you don't, they'll develop their own habits, or they'll act on their instincts. So I'm giving them all of the information that I think they need to race back to my loft. Now, a couple of weeks after that, let's say sometime in December, I'll jump ahead a bit there, sometimes in December I'll start letting those pigeons out in the morning. So it'll be the hens in the morning, cocks in the afternoon for 1 week, then the next week it'll be the cocks in the morning and the hens in the afternoon. Now, like I told you earlier, those pigeons are still learning to break left or right as they go in because they're in their separate sections. Now, I vaccinate the pigeons, or I'm in a little group of fanciers there that are friends, and we do all of that stuff together. So we vaccinate our pigeons around Christmas, New Year for PMV, pox, and of course now we do it for rota. Like Colin said, we had rota come up there in Brisbane and it wasn't killing the pigeons. And for the first couple of years, it made no difference. The pigeons raced well, they returned well. We had no problems at all. But then something changed. Now, I don't think anybody can tell you, I'm talking about Brisbane, I don't think anybody can tell you up there, if they get rota in their loft, what's it's going to do to their pigeons. It all seems to depend on what diseases are floating around within your loft. Some people will get it in, they'll lose a few pigeons, other people will get it in, like I get it in. On most of those years I got it in. In the end I had no symptoms. All I'd noticed was that, say, for a week or so, the pigeons, the amount of feed they ate dropped down by about half or even a quarter. And of course the droppings go off when they do that. A few pigeons are a bit fluffed up. That'd last a week, then it'd be gone. Then maybe a month later they'd do something similar. Now, I never had those pigeons tested, but I assumed that was rota going through them. And in 2019, it started to affect their racing performances. I couldn't get them up. I couldn't bring them up to that level I used to be able to bring them up. Because with this system that I've developed and the pigeons I've got, once I get them up to that right level, I can keep them there. But that year I couldn't. I'd get them up right, I'd get a bit of a place, and I'd drop right back down again. It was very frustrating. In 2020, I vaccinated once for rota with 5 mil instead of the 3, because that was a bit of a thing that was going around. And I had a better performance, but still not up where I was. But then in 2021, we vaccinated them the proper way, 2 sets, 4 weeks apart, and 2021 I was back up to where I was and won the averages and consistent again. So I vaccinate the pigeons for the pox and the rota with my little group. We also pull and we cut and pull the last 2 flights 14 days later, so we do that every year. Some people don't like to do that, but we always do it because when it gets around March to April there, the pigeons have got a very stable wing because that 9th and 10th flight are fully grown, and they only got the smaller flights growing inside of those, so you can get them working much better. Because we really got to get them working by April at the latest, because we start racing up there on the 1st of May. So that helps us to get those pigeons ready for training. You don't really need to do it for the racing, but you need to do it for that preparation to get them working, to get them training for the race. I also use lights in the loft. I keep those lights on up to 8 p.m. from January to March, to around about March. Now I'm a great believer that if you have extra lights in your loft, at that time of the year your pigeons will molt better, they'll molt the flights better. But then after March you turn those lights off, the pigeons will molt their body feathers much quicker. So that gets them through the molt much quicker, so all their flights will be fully grown, and they really drop those body feathers if you turn those lights off and tell them winter's almost here. They really get stuck into that body molt. I mentioned that there, lights off, growing things. Now, you were mentioning about hot weather under there. I've got underfloor ventilation and timers on my loft. I've also opened my loft up. I'll talk a little bit about my loft. I've got some more about that a bit later on, some scenes there, but I'll tell a little bit about it. I built a brand new loft in 2000, the year 2000, and I had an idea of how I wanted to build it. I've been planning it for years in my head and drawings and what have you. It's different to most other lofts, and I'll show you some pictures of it later. But when I finished it, in 2000, I couldn't get those pigeons to race well for at least 2 years. I had to dial that loft in. It just didn't have the right ventilation. That's how important things are with that. And then when I shifted the loft in 2004, we shifted from our old location, we went out to a new location. I put the loft down there, and again, the pigeons went off. They weren't as good. I just couldn't get them up, the same thing. What I had to do was I had to open up the whole back of that loft and put in new ventilation with a cowl over the top so it was bending the air to come in. Once I did that, and I also opened up a little bit at the top a bit more, the performances went right up. So the thing is, the point I'm sort of making is that no one can tell you how you should build your loft. You have to build your loft to your backyard, to what the environment's like. I mean, if you've got a lot of trees around, you'll have to take that into consideration. I've got a creek nearby down there. I've got some buildings at the back that upset the airflow and all those sort of things. All those things make a difference to your loft. Another thing about it too is, if you use pine, or plywood, if you put a lot of plywood in your loft, if that's green plywood, that can affect the pigeons for quite a few years. At least maybe two years that can affect your pigeons. That gives off a fumes and everything to it. So if you don't paint it, that can put your pigeons off too. I found that as well. Move on if we can. Okay, now I start working the pigeons, like I said there, from March. I start letting them all out together. Now the advantage of teaching those pigeons to break left or right starts to come into vogue for me now, because when I let them out all together and got them working, when I start calling them in, they automatically break left or right, because they've been doing that for months, and that's what the habit they've been taught, so that's what they do. So they more or less self-separate. Now I only get the sexes right about 90%, so I'm always going to have about 10 out of every 100 pigeons that I had the wrong sex to start with, and they're going to interfere with that and break across to the wrong side. So I just take care of that by, I've got a tennis racket, so there's a few taps like that. In no time those pigeons are cross, and in the end all I've got to do is walk in and tap the floor, and they know straight away, and they'll run back over to their own side. So separating them is really simple that way. Even though I'm working them together, I'm separating them when I call them in. Like I said about the pulled flights, they were fully grown after 6 to 8 weeks, and so the birds had a very stable wing, and so it's not that hard to get them up and getting them working. I have them working for about, you get them to work for about 30 to 45 minutes AM and PM. Now I assume you probably have the same problem down here, but up there, prior to Christmas or prior to New Year, we don't see that much of the peregrine falcon. The moment we seem to get into January, the peregrine falcon comes. And of course, trying to get young pigeons up, trying to get them to work and that, and get hit by the peregrine falcon day after day, it's so downheartening that even I, at times, with all the experience I've had racing for 38 years, I think, what the hell am I racing these pigeons for? Because they get so scared, they don't want to go up, they're hitting buildings and what have you, because they get hit so many times. The falcon menace is just getting worse and worse. But surprisingly, eventually they get up, they have to get used to that falcon, they have to understand what it is. It's far better that they're getting hit around the loft than to get hit for the first time when they're out on a 60k toss or something, because that way they go everywhere and they're not sure what they're doing. I mentioned that I want those pigeons to understand safety of the loft. I want them to get to that loft and get back into the loft. So I'm hoping that when they're away at a race and they see a falcon, it might just edge them on to go that much quicker, get back home where security is. So I've started tossing and I've got them on their full routine by mid-April. Now, mentioned about my loft, I've got a set of nest boxes in the end. I've got a separate section in the middle at the back of the loft. And I let those pigeons go into there. The moment I start tossing those pigeons, every time they come home, I let them go into that back section. The hens and cocks will come home, they'll go into the back section, they'll mingle and do what they like, because there's nest boxes there, they can play around, do all of that. I leave them in there all day Saturday. On Sundays, I always let them out Sunday morning. I give them a bath. I call them back in. Again, they self-separate because they're so used to going that way. I fully separate them after that, feed them all in. And then I don't let them out on Sunday afternoon. Now, once we get fully into or just before we get fully into the race season, I'm fully into my routine. So every Saturday, those birds have to go somewhere. They have to go to a 100-kilometre toss. Well, I'm looking for an hour and a half on the wing if I can get it every Saturday, or they have to go to a race. The reason for that is that I've built those pigeons up during the week, and I'll talk about that. I've built those pigeons up to a peak on that day, and now I have to take them down, because if I leave them up there, they'll stay up there and they'll be ready to race midweek. I don't want them ready to race midweek. They've got to be ready to race on Saturday, and the only way I can do that is to bring them back down a bit. So they go to that toss, they go to that race, that takes the edge off them. When they come home, I feed them very well on Saturday. I give them that bath and feed them well again on Sunday morning, but on Sunday night I don't feed them as well. Now the difficult part now is that, well, I've created that appetite in the pigeons by doing that. So Monday morning you always find your pigeons are hungry because they've done that exercise on the Saturday. They've had that feed, but not that much, and nothing much on Sunday night, and now they're really hungry on Monday. Now the key for me now is to build those pigeons up really slowly till we get to basketing night, because that's the last time that I've got any control over them. So can we go to the next one, see what's there? Okay, the feeding part of it, to my mind, everything in pigeon racing is important. Like I said, you've got to have a good system, a routine, you've got to have good pigeons, and you've got to have a good loft. But what really separates the good flyers from, well, the ones that perhaps aren't so good is feeding. If you can feed your pigeons properly, or correctly, it might be the more accurate term, you'll have a much better consistent season and much easier to win consistently if you can get that feeding right. And it's not easy to do. I've created appetite in those pigeons on that Monday. Now I have to satisfy that appetite by basketing night. And you think, oh, well, that's pretty easy. I'll just give them a bit more each day. The pigeons have got a crop, and we all know pigeons have got a crop. Racing pigeons don't need to have a crop. The only reason they got that is they're prey animals, everything wants to eat pigeons. So they're out and about, they see some feed, they come down, they can stuff that feed in their crop and they can take off somewhere and digest it. The problem with the crop is that that doesn't tell a pigeon when it's had enough to eat. So when I'm feeding those pigeons and slowly building them up, I have to give them enough feed so they're slowly increasing, but if I give them a bit too much, they'll fill that crop up, and the next feed they won't be so hungry. So instead of me having them on that slowly incline until I reach the peak on basketing night, those pigeons will be going up and down like this. And it's very, very difficult once they get into that to get them right. So what I'm saying is it's difficult. It's very difficult to feed them and get it right. You can understand how it should work, but actually doing it is difficult. You might be able to do it by weight. I guess some people do that. I don't. I feed them by hand, by observation. And that's come about by years and years of using this same system, and I can get it pretty well right. So that by the time we get to basketing night, I can offer those pigeons all the feed they want, and they eat very little. They eat very little because they've packed that feed in during the week that I've been giving them, and that feed has been converted into energy, and their breasts blow up because that's where they store all their energy in amongst their muscle fibres. So they've got all that energy stored in there, ready to go on race day. Now I have to take them back down again and start the whole process all over again. So that's the way the basic system sort of works. I mentioned earlier on that I had to teach them to eat, because that's the other part of it. If I've got those pigeons eating small grains, the other one's eating the maize, and I feed a lot of maize. If they're eating the maize and those ones are not, then they're getting mixed up again. They're not the same. So I had to teach them to eat properly. Like I mentioned about teaching them to be hungry, because pigeons, when you first bring them over, they don't understand what hunger is. They don't realise that if they're hungry, they've got to get back into their loft. That's all part of the learning curve. I've mentioned and ready to race on the Saturday and the gradual building up. And I mentioned the pigeon crop is the problem you have to overcome in feeding. Move on. That's a race mixture that I worked out. Well, that's the one from 2018. I think I won 6 federation races that year using that mixture, you can see. But it also changed it as the year goes on. So in March the percentages were less than what they were when we got to August and September. And an interesting thing with the type of grains. In my opinion, maize is the best grain to feed racing pigeons. I mean, you do, how should I say, pigeons race on fats, on the amino acid fats. We should all know that. And they're found a lot more in things like linseed and rape and those type of seeds. But if you feed too much linseed or rape, you put your pigeons off. You really do. Whereas you can feed them as much corn as you want and you won't put your pigeons off, because maize has a percentage of carbohydrate, but it also has a percentage of oils or fats. And there is a relationship between the amount of carbohydrates and the amount of fats you feed your pigeons. The liver of the pigeons also produces the right type of fats as well, because if you feed your pigeons no oil seeds whatsoever, they'll still produce energy to store in their body to race hungry. So obviously they can manufacture it in the liver. And I think you need to keep a balance between your carbohydrates and your fats. So if you're going to feed a lot more fats, then I think you need to add a lot more carbohydrates. What a lot of long distance flyers up in Brisbane do, they feed them a lot of linseed as they're building them up, but they also increase a lot of brown rice. They put a lot of brown rice in the mixture to balance it out. So move on.
Your percentages there, sorry to interrupt, are they by weight or by volume?
Just go back.
Please.
If you look there, I make the feed up by ratios. It's far easier to make a mixture up by ratios than it is by percentages, but they're showing you both.
Volume.
So on one column is the ratio.
Volume then? 4
Yeah,
cups,
well,
8 cups.
Yeah, well, that's ratio. So if you've got 4 cups to 2 cups, that's a ratio of 4 to 2 type. So it's far easier to make a mixture up. Sorry, it's far